There is a place at the southern edge of Europe where the land does not so much end as dissolve, where the earth grows thin and broken, where mountains rise up gently from the sea and then descend again, where small islands drift like stones cast across still water, resting there in the pale blue of the Aegean, each one unhurried in the haze of an old afternoon sun. This is the world that would one day come to be known as Greece. But for a very long time, it had no name at all. It was simply land and sea and sky, and the slow movement of seasons across a landscape that was already ancient before anyone thought to give it a name. The land itself is not a gentle land, not in the way of broad, open plains or soft river valleys. It is a land of edges, rocky edges where the mountains meet the shore, stony edges where the olive trees push their roots into thin soil and hold on with a kind of patient determination. The mountains here are not enormous mountains, not the kind that make a person feel crushed beneath their weight. They are smaller, older-feeling mountains, mountains that have been worn down by wind and rain and time, until they feel more like the memory of mountains than the mountains themselves. They are covered in low scrub and dry grasses that turn golden in the summer heat, and in the early morning they are wrapped in a thin, pale mist that clings to them the way sleep clings to a person who is not yet ready to wake. The sea is never far away. In all of this broken, scattered land, the sea is the one thing that is always present, always felt even when it cannot be seen. The smell of it drifts inland on the warm air, the salt of it, the faint coldness of it beneath the warmth, the sound of it lapping against the white and gray stones of the shore. The Aegean Sea is a sea of unusual color, a blue that shifts throughout the day from the pale silver of early morning to a deep and quiet indigo in the last hours before dusk. It is a sea of islands, hundreds of them, scattered across the water like seeds dropped from an open hand. Some of these islands are large enough to hold forests and rivers and small mountain ranges of their own. Others are little more than rocks rising from the water, barely large enough for a goat to stand upon, fringed with coarse, dry grass and the occasional sprawl of a gnarled and ancient tree. This is the world that the first people found when they came here, walking slowly southward through the long corridors of land that connect Europe to the older worlds to the east and south. They came, as people so often come, gradually. Not in a great movement, not in any way that would have seemed significant from the outside, but in the slow drift of small groups following rivers, following game, following the quiet pull of new land just over the next ridge. They were not yet Greek. That idea was still thousands of years away, still sleeping somewhere in the far distant future. They were simply people, carrying what they needed, pausing when they found a good place, moving on when the seasons or the land asked them to. The earliest traces of human life in the area that would become Greece are very old indeed. Archaeologists have found evidence of people living in caves in the northern regions of the peninsula as far back as 70,000 years or more, during a time when the world was still in the slow grip of the last great ice age, when the sea levels were lower than they are today, and the landscape looked quite different, broader, perhaps, less fragmented, the islands fewer and more connected to the mainland by stretches of land that have long since been swallowed by the rising waters. These earliest people left very little behind. A few stone tools shaped with patient hands, the dark stain of old fires on the walls of caves, the faint imprint of a life lived quietly, season by season, in a world that was enormous and unhurried. As the ice retreated, very slowly, over thousands of years, the land warmed and the forests thickened, and the sea rose to fill the low valleys between the mountains and the hills, creating the mosaic of land and water that is still visible today. The people who lived through these changes adapted to them gradually, as people always do, shifting their habits to match the shifting world. And sometime around 7,000 years before the Common Era, perhaps a little earlier in some places, people in this part of the world began to do something new. They began to stay. The transition from moving to staying, from following the land to tending it, was not a sharp turn. It was a gradual settling, like silt drifting down through still water to rest at the bottom of a quiet lake. People began to cultivate small patches of ground, to plant the seeds of emmer wheat and barley, to keep goats and sheep in loose arrangements around their settlements. They built structures small at first, little more than frameworks of wood and mud and thatch, the kind of dwelling that would not survive the years, that would return to earth almost as soon as it was abandoned. But in some places, on the good flat land of Thessaly in the north of the peninsula, in sheltered valleys where water was reliable and the soil was deep and dark, these settlements grew. They became villages of a kind. Collections of small mud brick houses arranged in no particular pattern, surrounded by the patchwork of cultivated fields that extended outward into the surrounding landscape. These Neolithic villages, Neolithic meaning simply the time of the new stone, when tools were made from carefully shaped and polished rock rather than chipped flint, were not large places. A settlement might have held a few hundred people at most, all of them connected by ties of family and proximity and shared work. The days in these places would have had a rhythm to them, a slow and repetitive rhythm that is not so different from the rhythm of agricultural life in many parts of the world today. The rhythm of planting and waiting and harvesting, the rhythm of morning and evening, of wet season and dry season, of birth and death, and the long, unremarkable passage of days. One of the most studied of these early settlements is a place called Sesklo, in Thessaly, which appears to have been occupied from around 6,500 years before the Common Era. The people who lived at Sesklo built their houses of mud brick and painted the walls of some of them in a red and white geometric pattern, simple triangles and diamonds and chevrons, repeated in quiet rhythms across the plastered surfaces. These painted walls are among the earliest examples of decorative art found in Europe, and there is something moving about them, though moving in a very quiet way. Someone, thousands of years ago in the early morning or the late afternoon, took the time to make patterns on a wall, not because it was necessary, because it was pleasing, because the human eye, even then, sought out repetition and order and the soft beauty of a repeated form. Not far from Sesklo, another important Neolithic settlement called Dimini has left behind evidence of a somewhat more organized community, one with a series of concentric walls surrounding a central courtyard, an arrangement that suggests some degree of planning, some shared understanding of how a place should be organized, some early sense of what a community might look like when it thought about itself deliberately. The pottery found at Dimini and at Sesklo is elegant in a restrained way, decorated with spirals and meanders, the spiral being one of the oldest and most universal of human decorative motifs, found in cultures separated by vast distances of time and space, as though the spiral were something the human hand returns to naturally, the way the eye returns to the horizon. These Neolithic people kept animals. They wove cloth on simple looms. They made small figurines of clay, roundish, heavy-hipped figures that may have represented a goddess or a spirit or simply the idea of abundance, of fertility, of the earth's capacity to sustain life. They ground grain on flat stones and baked bread in clay ovens. They buried their dead with care, sometimes with small offerings placed beside the body, a cup, a bead, a handful of grain. These burials tell us something about belief, or at least about feeling, the sense that the dead deserve to be accompanied by something, that the crossing from life to whatever came after was a journey worth preparing for. The centuries turned, very slowly. Rain fell and the grain grew and was harvested. Children were born and grew old and were buried in the ground. The walls of houses crumbled and were rebuilt, layer upon layer, so that over centuries a village would slowly rise on the accumulated debris of its own past, building itself a small hill made of the remains of previous lives. These accumulated mounds, called tells or magulas in the Greek landscape, are still visible in parts of Thessaly today, gentle rises in the flat agricultural land, covered now in grass, holding their deep secrets quietly. And then, sometime around the third millennium before the Common Era, around 5,000 years ago, in the round, unhurried arithmetic of deep time, things began to change again. Metal arrived. First copper, worked cold by hammering, then bronze, that alloy of copper and tin that is harder and more useful than either element alone. The Bronze Age came to the Aegean world in the way that all great changes seem to come to this landscape, gradually from the east, carried by traders and travelers moving along the old routes through Anatolia and across the sea. The world did not change overnight. It shifted over generations as new tools and new ideas and new ways of organizing people and resources slowly worked their way into the fabric of daily life. In the Aegean, the Bronze Age would eventually give rise to two of the most remarkable early civilizations of the ancient world, civilizations that did not call themselves Greek, that would not have recognized that name, but that would lay down certain patterns of life and art and organization that would echo forward into everything that came after. The first of these civilizations arose not on the mainland, but on the large island to the south, the long, narrow island of Crete, which lies in the sea like a sleeping figure, stretched out between the Aegean and the Libyan waters, its spine of mountains rising and falling from east to west in long, unhurried rhythms. The people of ancient Crete, known today as the Minoans, a name given to them by the archaeologist Arthur Evans when he excavated their ruins at the beginning of the 20th century, a name drawn from the legend of Minos, the ancient king of Crete, developed a civilization of considerable refinement and complexity during the second and third millennia before the Common Era. They built large, sprawling structures that archaeologists call palaces, though they may have served as much as administrative and religious centers as they did as royal residences. The largest of these, at a place called Knossos in the north of the island, covered a considerable area, a labyrinthine complex of rooms and corridors and storerooms and light wells, built in stages over many centuries, constantly added to and modified, so that the final result was a place of great complexity and one imagines a certain quiet grandeur. Knossos is a warm place. Even now, walking among the reconstructed ruins on a summer afternoon, the light falls golden and heavy on the pale stone and the deep red of the reconstructed wooden columns, columns that are, unusually, wider at the top than at the bottom, giving them a distinctive silhouette that is unlike anything else in the ancient world. The light wells opened shafts that allowed air and sunlight to penetrate into the deep interior of the palace, still suggests something about the sensibility of the people who built this place. An attention to the quality of light, a concern for the movement of air through a space, a desire, it seems, to bring the outside gently inward, to allow the brightness of the Cretan sky to reach even into the innermost rooms. The walls of Knossos were painted with frescoes, brilliant, flowing images that have survived in fragments, painstakingly reconstructed by Evans and his team to give us a sense of the world that the Minoans inhabited or imagined. There are dolphins curving through deep blue water. There are young figures, their skin painted a warm reddish brown, their bodies lithe and easy in movement, grasping the horns of enormous bulls, leaping over them in some ceremony or ritual or sport that we do not fully understand and perhaps never will. There are women in elaborate flounced skirts, their hair dressed in careful ringlets, their eyes dark and wide, holding objects, perhaps sacred objects, in their careful hands. There are fields of lilies and crocuses, painted in colors that still hold a softness, a gentleness, despite their great age. The world of the Minoan frescoes is a world that seems, at least on the surface, to have loved beauty in a quiet and habitual way. Beauty not as spectacle but as the ordinary texture of daily life. The Minoans were traders. Their ships moved across the Aegean and beyond, carrying the goods of Crete, olive oil, wine, fine pottery, cloth, perhaps timber from the island's once extensive forests, to Egypt and the Levant and the many islands of the Aegean. Egyptian records mention Crete. The artwork of the Minoan world shows influences absorbed from Egypt and from the cultures of the Near East, worked into something distinctly its own. The Minoans developed their own systems of writing, a script known as Linear A, which has never been deciphered, which remains one of the quiet mysteries of the ancient world, its meaning locked away in the marks pressed into clay tablets and painted on pottery, waiting with great patience for someone to understand it. The civilization of Minoan Crete reached what appears to have been its greatest extent sometime around the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. The palaces were large and well organized. Trade was extensive. The art was flourishing. And then slowly, the evidence begins to suggest disruption. Around 1450 BCE, many of the Minoan sites across Crete show signs of destruction, burning, abandonment, the abrupt cessation of the smooth continuity of palace life. The reasons for this disruption are still discussed and debated by scholars. A volcanic eruption on the island of Thera to the north, sometime in the 17th or 16th century BCE, may have sent tsunamis and ash southward toward Crete, disrupting agriculture and trade, weakening the fabric of palace society over a generation or more. Earthquake may have played a role. And then there were the people from the north. While Minoan civilization had been flowering on Crete, a different kind of Bronze Age society had been developing on the Greek mainland, in the Peloponnese, in Boeotia, in the broad plains of Thessaly. These people, who spoke an early form of the Greek language, are known today as the Mycenaeans, after Mycenae, the hilltop citadel in the northeastern Peloponnese that was once believed to have been the greatest of their centers, the seat of the legendary king Agamemnon. The Mycenaean world was in many ways darker and heavier than the Minoan. Where the Minoan palaces feel open and painted with light, the Mycenaean citadels are fortified, built of enormous limestone blocks, stones so vast that later Greeks, looking at the ruined walls and unable to imagine any ordinary human labor assembling them, called them Cyclopean, the work of the one-eyed giants of their mythology. The walls of Mycenae rise steeply from the rocky hillside, gray and massive, their great weight still impressive even now, even worn and broken as they are by the long passage of time. The entrance to the citadel passes beneath the Lion Gate, a lintel of enormous stone, above which two stone lions rear up on either side of a central column, their heads, now lost, once turned outward to meet the gaze of anyone approaching. It is one of the oldest surviving examples of monumental sculpture in Europe, and it conveys, even in its partial state, something of the Mycenaean character, a concern with power, with the display of strength, with the impression made upon those who approach from outside. Within the walls of Mycenae, archaeologists have found the famous shaft graves, deep rectangular shafts cut into the rock, filled with the bodies of the dead and with objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. Gold death masks pressed over the faces of the deceased, swords with handles decorated in inlaid gold and silver, cups of hammered gold, bronze daggers inlaid with hunting scenes in gold and electrum and silver, the tiny figures of men and lions still vivid after 3,500 years. The wealth here is remarkable, and yet it is a quiet kind of wealth, a wealth that speaks not so much of exuberance as of the careful accumulation and concentration of resources in the hands of a few powerful figures. The Mycenaean world, if it can be called a single world, which it cannot quite, being rather a collection of palace centers that shared a culture and a language without ever forming a unified political entity, was organized around these citadels. Knossos, Mycenae, Turin, Pylos, Thebes, Athens, all of these sites show evidence of the same kind of palace administration, the same clay tablets inscribed in a script called Linear B, which was deciphered in the mid-20th century by the architect Michael Ventris, and proved to be an early form of Greek. The tablets are administrative documents, records of grain deliveries and lists of workers and inventories of bronze and wool. They are not literature. They are the quiet paperwork of a complex economy, the kind of record-keeping that exists wherever enough surplus is being produced to require careful counting. The Mycenaean world was also a world of war. The Linear B tablets record soldiers and weapons. The grave goods include swords and spear points. The frescoes found at Mycenaean sites, more restrained and martial than the flowing Minoan paintings, show warriors and hunting scenes. Later Greek tradition remembered the Mycenaean age as a heroic age, a time of great kings and legendary wars. And while the historical reality was surely more mundane and gradual than the epic tradition suggests, there is something true in the memory of Mycenae as a warrior culture, organized around the citadel and the king, and the redistribution of wealth gathered through trade and tribute, and sometimes force. This was the world into which the earliest forms of Greek identity were being slowly, quietly, invisibly shaped, not as a conscious project, not as anything that anyone living at the time would have recognized as the beginning of something significant, but in the shared language of the Linear B tablets, in the shared form of the palace economy, in the shared iconography of the frescoes and the grave goods, something was accumulating, a common culture, a common way of organizing the world, a common set of stories and images and habits of mind. This accumulation was so slow as to be imperceptible from within. It was the kind of change that happens over centuries, over generations, in the small daily choices of people who are simply trying to live their lives. The land around them was still the same land, the dry rocky mountains, the thin soil, the sea always present on the warm air. The olive trees were already old. The light fell the same way across the pale stone in the late afternoon, warm and golden and unhurried. The seasons turned as they always had turned, the winter rains greening the hillsides, the summer heat bleaching them back to gold. And the people who lived in this land, in their Neolithic villages and their Bronze Age citadels, were slowly, without knowing it, becoming something. They were becoming the ancestors of what the world would later call Greece. The oldest stories would come much later. The gods and heroes and the great poems, those were still centuries away, still sleeping in the future, still waiting for the right moment to rise up from the accumulated experience of this people and take their final, memorable form. But the soil was already prepared. The roots were already deep. The land had already been holding human life for so long that it had absorbed it, and the life had absorbed the land, and the two had become, very gradually, inseparable. This was the beginning. Not a dramatic beginning, not a sudden or sharp beginning, but a beginning as gradual and inevitable as the turning of the seasons, as the slow accumulation of silt at the mouth of a river, as the patient growth of an olive tree in thin, stony soil, reaching toward a sky that is very old and very blue and very still. The stars above this ancient land are the same stars that were visible to the first people who sheltered in the caves of the north, who painted their walls in spirals, who buried their dead with cups of grain. The nights in Greece are warm in summer, and the darkness is soft, and the stars are very clear above the mountains, and below them the sea moves with a quiet, unhurried sound against the pale stones of the shore. And somewhere in that warm darkness, in those first long centuries of human life in this place, the world that would one day be called Greece was sleeping, already full of everything it would one day become, dreaming its long, slow dream in the warm Mediterranean night. There is something about the end of things that is rarely loud. The great silences of history, the moments when a civilization simply ceases, when the fires in the palace hearths go cold, and the scribes set down their tablets, and the merchants no longer arrive at the harbor with their ships heavy with goods. These endings tend to come not as a single shattering event, but as a gradual quieting, a slow diminishment, like the last light leaving the sky at the end of a long summer evening. The Bronze Age world of the Aegean, that intricate and quietly remarkable network of palace economies and trading routes and painted walls, came to its end in something very much like this way. Slowly, incompletely, with a great deal of uncertainty still surrounding exactly what happened and why, even now, even after generations of careful scholarship and patient excavation. To understand this ending, it is perhaps useful to remain for a little while longer in the world that was ending, to sit with it, to let its textures become familiar before they fade. The Mycenaean world at its height, somewhere around the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era, was a world of considerable organization and complexity. The palace centers, Mycenae and Tiryns in the Argolid, Pylos on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, Thebes in Boeotia, Orchomenos nearby, and others scattered across the mainland and on the island of Crete, which by this point had come under Mycenaean influence or control. These palaces were not simply residences for powerful rulers. They were the centers of elaborate economic systems, the hubs around which the production and distribution of goods was organized and recorded and controlled. At Pylos, perhaps the best preserved of the Mycenaean palace sites, the excavations of the 20th century revealed the remains of a building of considerable sophistication. The main hall, the megaron, a word that simply means great room, a long rectangular space with a central hearth and four columns supporting the roof, was decorated with frescoes of the kind familiar from the Mycenaean world, warriors and hunting scenes and processions, all painted in the flat, careful style that distinguishes Mycenaean art from its more flowing Minoan predecessor. Around this central hall spread dozens of smaller rooms, storerooms packed with the enormous clay jars called pithae, which once held oil and wine and grain in quantities large enough to sustain a palace household and to serve as reserves for redistribution. Administrative rooms where the scribes worked with their clay tablets, recording in their careful linear signs the endless transactions of the palace economy. The linear tablets from Pylos are among the most informative records we have of Mycenaean life, and they speak, in their dry administrative way, of a world that was deeply organized. There are records of land tenure, who held which plot of ground, and under what obligations. There are lists of workers assigned to various tasks, rowers for the ships, women working at looms producing cloth of different grades and qualities, smiths receiving their allocations of bronze for the manufacture of tools and weapons. There are records of religious offerings, the names of gods receiving their portions of grain and oil and animal, and among these names one finds, with a quiet sense of connection, names that would survive into the later Greek tradition. Poseidon, who in the later mythology would be the god of the sea, here receiving his offerings in the tablets of a Bronze Age palace. Zeus, too, appears in these records. Hera, Artemis. The gods were already present, already being offered to, already woven into the fabric of daily life, though the great myths surrounding them were still taking shape, still accumulating the layers of story that would eventually produce the texts we know. Outside the palace walls, the landscape of the Mycenaean world was domesticated in a quiet and thorough way. The large plain of Argos, in the northeastern Peloponnese, had been drained and organized for agriculture by an extensive system of irrigation and water management. The roads, unpaved but maintained, following the contours of the land, connected the palace centers to one another and to the smaller settlements that depended on them. Merchants and emissaries traveled these roads, carrying goods and information between the palaces. Traders arrived at the harbors with copper from Cyprus, tin from sources in the north and east, ivory from Egypt and the Levant, gold and silver in various forms. The Mycenaean world was not isolated. It was part of a broader Bronze Age network that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia to the islands of the Aegean and beyond, a network of exchange and influence that had been operating for centuries. And then this network began to fray. The fraying was not immediate, and it was not caused by any single event, though single events certainly played their part. The Late Bronze Age, the period between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, was a time of widespread disruption across the eastern Mediterranean world. Not only Mycenaean Greece, but the great Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the palace centers of Cyprus, the cities of the Levanten coast, the administrative heartland of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria. All of these experienced destruction or severe disruption within a relatively short span of time, in historical terms. The breadth of this disruption has led modern scholars to speak of a Bronze Age collapse, a phrase that captures something of the scale of what happened without quite explaining it. The explanations that scholars have proposed are many, and most of them are probably partially right. There were the Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders whose origins are still debated, who appear in Egyptian records as invaders from the sea, who struck at coastal settlements across the eastern Mediterranean with a persistence and effectiveness that caused considerable disruption to trade and stability. There were droughts. Paleoclimatological research in recent decades has suggested that a prolonged period of reduced rainfall affected the eastern Mediterranean during this period, stressing the agricultural systems on which the palace economies depended, reducing the surpluses that the palaces redistributed, creating the kind of slow pressure that, over years and decades, can undermine even a well-organized system. There were earthquakes. The Aegean is a seismically active region, and the archaeological record shows evidence of seismic damage at several Mycenaean sites. There were, perhaps, internal tensions within the Mycenaean world itself, resentments built up over generations between the palace centers and the communities that supported them, between the few who administered the system and the many who labored within it. All of these pressures, whatever their precise combination and sequence, produced the same result. The palaces, one by one, ceased to function. At Pylos, the end seems to have come in the form of fire. The palace burned, and the heat of that fire baked the clay tablets in the administrative rooms, inadvertently preserving them for the archaeologists who would find them 3,000 years later. The fire at Pylos is dated to around 1180 BCE, give or take a few decades. The palace was not rebuilt. The site was not reoccupied as a palace center. Whatever had made Pylos the hub of a complex economic system was gone, and it did not return. Mycenae and Turin survived for somewhat longer, their great cyclopean walls still standing, still enclosing some kind of organized community, but the complexity and reach of their earlier power had contracted. The linear script, that carefully maintained administrative tool, the technology of palace record-keeping, disappeared from the record. When writing ceases, when the scribes no longer have tablets to fill and no longer train apprentices in the necessary skills, something more than just a practical tool is lost. The loss of writing is a marker of a profound simplification of social organization, a reduction in the scale and complexity of the systems that writing had served to support. Without writing, the palace economies could not function in their earlier form. Without the palace economies, the network of exchange that had sustained the wider Aegean trading world could not operate. Things became smaller. The horizon contracted. The world grew quiet in a way that was not entirely peaceful. This period of contraction, roughly from 1100 BCE to around 800 BCE, though the dates are approximate and the transition gradual, is known to historians as the Greek Dark Ages. The name carries certain connotations that are worth setting aside. It does not mean a time of moral darkness, of cruelty or suffering beyond what any age contains. It means, more precisely, a time that is dark to us, dark in the sense of being poorly illuminated by the archaeological and written record, a time from which relatively little survives in the way of material culture, and from which no written texts emerge, because writing had disappeared. It was, in many ways, a quieter time than what had come before. A simpler time, in the sense that the elaborate systems of palace administration and long-distance trade had dissolved, leaving behind smaller, more local communities living closer to the rhythms of the land. The population of Greece, and this can be estimated very roughly from the density of archaeological sites and the patterns of settlement, appears to have declined significantly during the early Dark Ages. Many settlements were abandoned. People concentrated in smaller communities, often in more defensible locations, living in simpler structures, making simpler pottery, engaging in less specialized craft production. The elaborate art of the Mycenaean period, the frescoes, The inlaid daggers, the gold death masks disappeared. What replaced it was simpler, more geometric. The pottery of the early Dark Ages is decorated with angular patterns, lines and triangles and meanders, worked in a dark paint on a lighter ground, or vice versa, with a kind of patient, repetitive care that is its own form of beauty, even if it is a quieter and less immediately striking beauty than what had come before. In these smaller, simpler communities, life went on. Grain was planted and harvested. Animals were tended. Children were born. The dead were buried with offerings placed beside them, fewer and simpler offerings than those in the Mycenaean shaft graves, but offerings nonetheless, the same ancient impulse expressing itself in more modest material form. The sea was still there, and the mountains, and the thin rocky soil and the olive trees and the smell of thyme and oregano on the dry summer air. The constellations moved across the sky in their unhurried courses. The seasons turned. And in the turning of those quiet seasons, in the small and daily life of these reduced communities, something was happening that would eventually produce remarkable results. The stories were being told. In the absence of writing, in the long evenings around fires in the simple houses of the Dark Age communities, the oral tradition was carrying forward the memories of the Bronze Age, the memories of the great citadels and the powerful kings, the memories of wars and voyages and heroes and gods. These memories were not historical records in any strict sense. They were transformed by the retelling, shaped by the needs and values and imaginative priorities of the communities that told them, elaborated and simplified and elaborated again over generations, so that by the time they eventually found their way into written form, centuries later, they had become something quite different from whatever historical reality lay behind them. They had become mythology. They had become poetry of a particular and enduring kind. The tradition that would eventually produce the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two great poems attributed to Homer, whose existence as a historical individual is itself uncertain, who may have been a single poet or a tradition of poets or some complex combination of both. This tradition was forming and reforming during the Dark Ages, in the mouths and memories of the singers called Edda, the bards who performed the stories of the heroes at the feasts of local leaders, who knew hundreds of formulaic phrases and scenes that could be combined and recombined in the performance of long narrative poems. The Edda were not writing anything down. They were holding vast amounts of material in a memory trained from childhood to retain and recombine and perform. The poetry they produced was oral in a deep structural sense, built of repeated phrases and scenes and story patterns that served as the building blocks of composition in performance. The world they sang about was, in certain details, the Mycenaean world, the great bronze weapons, the types of shields, the geographical knowledge of certain sites. But it was also, in its values and social arrangements and emotional priorities, the world of the Dark Ages themselves, the world in which the singers and their audiences actually lived. The heroes of the tradition, Achilles and Odysseus and Agamemnon and the rest, were figures who moved through a world that was neither purely Mycenaean nor purely Dark Age, but a composite, a poetic world with its own internal consistency, sustained by the conventions of the tradition. This tradition was long, centuries long, and during those centuries while the tradition was forming, the material world of the Greek communities was not entirely static. Change was slow, but it was happening. The population, which had declined in the early Dark Ages, was gradually recovering. New settlements were being established. The range of goods traded and exchanged was slowly expanding again. The isolation of the early Dark Age communities was gradually, imperceptibly giving way to renewed contact, first with neighboring communities, then with more distant ones, then, as the ninth and 8th centuries approached, with the wider Mediterranean world. Crete, that large island to the south, had never entirely gone quiet. Even through the disruptions that had ended the Minoan palace civilization and the subsequent Mycenaean domination of the island, Cretan communities had maintained a degree of continuity that the mainland had not. In certain areas of Crete, particularly in the mountainous interior, communities preserved elements of Bronze Age culture, including, at a site called Knossos, continuous occupation from the Minoan period through the Dark Ages and into the later periods, a thread of continuity that is remarkable for its length and its quiet persistence. On the island of Euboea, off the eastern coast of the Greek mainland, communities in the town of Lefkandi maintained connections with the wider Aegean world even during the depths of the Dark Ages. At Lefkandi, archaeologists discovered a remarkable structure dating to around 1000 BCE, a long building of a kind that has no exact parallel elsewhere in the contemporary Greek world, within which were found the cremated remains of a warrior, buried with his iron sword and his spear, and the body of a woman buried with gold jewelry of considerable quality, and the remains of horses sacrificed and buried nearby. This burial speaks of a community that, even in the reduced circumstances of the Dark Ages, maintained connections to a wider world, had access to luxury goods, and preserved a sense of ceremony and status that would not have been out of place in an earlier or later period. Lefkandi is a reminder that the Dark Ages were not uniformly dark, that within the general quieting of the period, there were pockets of vitality and continuity that would provide some of the threads from which the later world would be woven. The transition from the Dark Ages to what scholars call the Archaic period of Greek history was not a sudden brightening. It was the same kind of gradual lightening that one finds at dawn in a landscape where the clouds are thick, a slow increase in the quality of light, a slow emergence of detail from the gray, a long and quiet transition from one state to another. The communities of Greece were growing. The trade routes were reopening. The world was becoming, very slowly, more connected and more complex again. And in this slowly brightening world, new ideas were beginning to stir, ideas about how communities should be organized, about the relationship between individuals and their communities, about the nature of the gods and the cosmos and the proper ordering of human life. Somewhere in the later part of this transition, the great poems were taking their final shape. The tradition of oral poetry was encountering, again, the technology of writing, not the old linear B script, which had been lost entirely, but a new alphabet borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians of the Levanten coast, a script of remarkable simplicity and flexibility, a script in which any sound of the spoken language could be represented by a small number of symbols, a script that, unlike the complex syllabic systems of the Bronze Age, could be learned without years of specialized training. This new alphabet, once adopted, spread quickly through the Greek-speaking world, and with it came the possibility of writing down what had previously only been spoken and remembered. The poems of the tradition, or some of them, or the versions of some of them that had achieved a certain degree of fixity through long repetition, were written down. They became texts. The Iliad and the Odyssey, whatever their exact origins and whatever the exact process by which they achieved their surviving form, became the oldest surviving works of European literature. The world of the Bronze Age from which these poems drew their setting was already very remote by the time the poems were written down, remote in time, remote in material conditions, transformed by the long passage of the oral tradition into something more myth than history. But certain things endured. The names of the heroes, the names of the gods, the sense of a heroic past in which great things had been done, in which the relationship between humans and the divine had been immediate and consequential, in which the world had been larger and more vivid than it seemed in the quieter present. This sense of a heroic past, this looking backward to a time of greatness, would be one of the persistent characteristics of Greek culture in all the centuries that followed, a way of measuring the present against an idealized past that was always receding further into the comfortable distance of legend. The Bronze Age was over. The Dark Ages were fading. The memory of Mycenae and its great walls, of the ships assembled at Aulis, of the 10 years before the walls of Troy, of the long wandering of the man of many ways, all of this was passing into the realm of story, where it would live for a very long time indeed, preserved in the amber of poetry, stable and golden and unhurried, while the living world moved on into whatever came next. The great stones of the Cyclopean walls still stood on their hillsides, grayed by the passage of time, draped in the slow growth of lichen and vine. The shaft graves lay quiet beneath the earth. The painted walls of Knossos were buried under centuries of accumulated soil, waiting for the patient shovels of future archaeologists. And Greece, the idea of Greece, that slow accumulation of shared language and shared story and shared land, was preparing very quietly to wake. There is a particular quality to the light in Greece in the early morning, in those first slow hours after dawn when the sun has not yet climbed high enough to bleach the color from the landscape, when the shadows are still long and soft, and the air carries a coolness that will not last through the day. In this light, the stones of the hillsides are pale gold, and the olive trees cast their thin, dappled shadows across the dry earth, and the sea, visible from almost any high place in this broken and sea-surrounded land, holds the color of the sky in a way that makes it difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. It is in this kind of light, gradual, gentle, slowly brightening, that one might imagine the Greek world emerging from the long quietness of the Dark Ages into the period that historians call the Archaic, that era of slow reawakening that stretched from roughly the 8th century before the Common Era through to the early 5th, a span of 300 years or so in which the world that we tend to think of, when we think of ancient Greece, was taking its essential shape. The word archaic comes from the Greek word for beginning, for the old and original, and it carries within it something of the quality of the period it names. The archaic period was a time of beginnings, not sudden beginnings, not dramatic ones, but the slow, cumulative beginnings of things that would define Greek civilization for centuries to come. The city-state was taking shape. The alphabet was spreading. The great oral tradition of poetry was finding its way into written form. The first philosophers were beginning to ask, in a quiet and persistent way, the questions about the nature of the world that would eventually become the discipline of philosophy. The Olympic Games were being established. The practice of founding colonies across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea was carrying Greek culture outward into new landscapes, new climates, new encounters with peoples and ideas that would, in turn, come back and enrich the culture that had sent the colonists out. All of this was happening at once, and none of it was happening quickly, and all of it was connected to all of it in ways that are easier to trace looking backward than they could ever have been to anyone living through them. The fundamental unit of this emerging world was the polis, the city-state, that distinctive form of political organization that the Greeks developed, and that would become one of their most enduring contributions to the broader history of human civilization. The word polis is usually translated as city-state, but the translation is somewhat misleading because it suggests a scale and a degree of urbanization that most polis did not possess. A polis was not necessarily a large city in the modern sense. It was a community of citizens, of free adult men who shared in the governance of a defined territory, who owed obligations to one another and to the shared institutions of the community, and who were bound together by a common set of cults, festivals, myths, and physical spaces. The polis was at once a political entity, a religious community, a social world, and a way of understanding one's place in the larger order of things. It was, for the Greeks who lived within it, the essential frame of civilized existence. A person without a polis, a person exiled from their community, cut off from the shared life of citizens, was, in the Greek understanding, barely a person at all. The physical heart of the polis was the Acropolis, the high city, the defensible rocky outcrop on which the earliest settlements had been built, which in later times became the location of the most important temples and sacred spaces, the highest and most visible point of the community's relationship with its gods. Around and below the Acropolis spread the lower city, the Agora, the open public space where citizens gathered to transact business and discuss public affairs, where the stalls of merchants were set up, and the courts of law met, and the voices of politicians and philosophers and ordinary people mixed in the warm air. The Agora was not a grand or formally planned space in the early archaic period. It was more of an organic gathering place, a space that defined itself through use, that accumulated meaning through the accumulated weight of all the meetings and transactions and arguments and festivals that took place within it over the years and decades and centuries. Beyond the urban center, such as it was, stretched the agricultural land that supported the community. This was, in most cases, the majority of the polis's territory. Greece was an agricultural civilization in its foundations, and the rhythms of agricultural life, the planting and harvesting of grain, the tending of olive groves and vineyards, the grazing of sheep and goats on the rocky hillsides, provided the material basis on which everything else rested. The citizens who gathered in the Agora to discuss the affairs of the community were, for the most part, farmers, or the descendants of farmers, or men whose wealth derived from agricultural land. The connection between citizenship and land, between belonging to the community and owning a piece of its territory, was deep and persistent in Greek political thought. The polis of the archaic period were not all the same. They varied enormously in size, in wealth, in political organization, in the particular mix of cults and myths and local traditions that gave each its distinctive character. There were hundreds of them, scattered across the Greek peninsula and the islands of the Aegean, and as the period progressed, planted by colonization across the shores of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Some of the larger and more historically significant ones, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Argos, Thebes, would loom large in the later historical tradition, their particular stories and characters shaping the way that Greek history has been remembered and understood. But it is worth remembering, in the quiet way that facts often deserve to be held, that for most of the people who lived in the Greek world, the polis that mattered was the one they actually lived in, a smaller, less famous community whose name is remembered now only by specialists, whose particular story has been largely absorbed into the broader narrative that history tends to construct around its most prominent examples. The political organization of the early polis was, in most cases, aristocratic, governed by a small number of powerful families, whose claim to authority rested on the combination of wealth, lineage, and the control of land that had been accumulating in their hands over the generations of the Dark Ages. These aristocratic families, the Eupatridae, the well-born, in the Athenian tradition, monopolized political office, controlled the courts of law, and maintained their authority through the networks of obligation and patronage that bound their clients and dependents to them. This was not a static or comfortable arrangement. The tensions within and between aristocratic families, and the tensions between the aristocracy as a whole and the broader population of free farmers and craftsmen and traders, whose lives were shaped by aristocratic decisions, were a persistent source of political energy throughout the archaic period. Energy that would eventually produce, in Athens and in other polis, the remarkable political experiments of the late archaic and early classical periods. But before those experiments, there was a period of what one might call political turbulence, though turbulence is too energetic a word for what was often a slow and grinding process. In many polis, the accumulated resentments of the non-aristocratic population, combined with the ambitions of certain individuals who saw in popular discontent an opportunity for personal advancement, produced a characteristic archaic political figure, the tyrant. The Greek word tyrannos did not, in its original usage, carry the strongly negative connotation it has acquired in later usage. It simply meant a ruler who had come to power by unconventional means, outside the normal channels of aristocratic succession or election. A man who had seized power, often with popular support, and who ruled as an individual rather than as part of a collegial aristocratic system. The tyrants of the archaic period were, in many cases, effective and even beneficial rulers. Periander of Corinth, Polycrates of Samos, Pisistratos of Athens, these were men who built public works, patronized the arts, encouraged trade, and provided a degree of stability and order that their communities had sometimes lacked under the fractious competition of aristocratic factions. Pisistratos, who ruled Athens with interruptions during the middle part of the 6th century BCE, is particularly interesting as a figure of the period. Under his rule and that of his sons, Athens grew significantly in economic power and cultural prestige. The Panathenaic festival, celebrating the goddess Athena as the patron of the city, was reorganized and expanded under his patronage. The texts of the Homeric poems may have been given something closer to their canonical form during this period, recited in full at the Panathenaic festival in a carefully organized sequence. The black figure and then the red figure pottery traditions of Athens, those extraordinarily refined ceramic traditions, whose surviving examples fill the display cases of museums around the world, were developing and flourishing during this period. Corinth in the northeastern Peloponnese was during the archaic period perhaps the most commercially dynamic of the Greek polis. Situated on the narrow isthmus connecting the Greek mainland to the Peloponnese, with harbors giving access to both the Aegean and the Adriatic seas, Corinth was ideally placed for trade, and its citizens took full advantage of this placement. Corinthian pottery, distinctive in its careful figural decoration, Its processional animals and its mythological scenes, worked in a style that is immediately recognizable, was traded across the Mediterranean world. The city was wealthy in a way that was, for the Greek world of its time, somewhat unusual, a wealth derived not primarily from agriculture but from the profits of commerce. Corinth also participated actively in the great wave of colonization that was one of the defining movements of the Archaic period. The colonization movement, the steady outward flow of Greek settlers to new communities on the shores of distant seas, was one of the most significant developments of the Archaic period, and it had roots in several different pressures and motivations. Population growth, in a landscape where the agricultural land was limited and often already fully divided, meant that there were, in many communities, more mouths than the existing land could comfortably feed. Political conflicts within polis sometimes resulted in the exile or voluntary departure of groups who then sought to establish themselves elsewhere. The desire for new trading opportunities, new sources of grain, timber, metals, and the other resources that the Greek homeland was sometimes short of, motivated both individual merchants and the communities that sponsored colonial expeditions. The colonies that resulted from this movement were not dependent territories or subject settlements in the way that later colonial enterprises would often be. They were independent polis, communities that, once established, governed themselves according to their own constitutions and pursued their own interests, maintaining an honorific relationship with their mother city but not a political subordination to it. A colony would remember its founding city, would perhaps worship the same patron deity, maintain the same calendar of festivals, feel a sense of kinship with the community from which its founders had come. But it was its own place, with its own character shaped by the landscape and climate, and neighbors it encountered in its new location. The geographic range of Greek colonization in the Archaic period was remarkable. To the west, Greek settlers established communities along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily, a region so thoroughly settled by Greeks that later writers would call it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. The cities of Syracuse in Sicily, Croton and Sybaris and Tarentum in southern Italy, Massalia in what is now southern France. All of these were Greek foundations of the Archaic period, communities that carried with them the language, the religious practices, the artistic traditions, and the political forms of the Greek world, and planted them in new soils, where they would develop in their own distinctive directions. To the north and east, Greek colonists moved along the coasts of the Black Sea, establishing settlements at the mouths of the great rivers, the Danube, the Dnieper, the Don, where they could trade with the peoples of the interior. Byzantium, at the mouth of the strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea, the city that would one day become Constantinople and then Istanbul, was a Greek colonial foundation of this period. This outward movement changed the Greek world in ways that went far beyond the simple expansion of territory. The encounter with other peoples and other cultures, with the Lydians of Western Anatolia, with the Egyptians, with the various peoples of Italy and the Western Mediterranean, with the Scythians of the Black Sea steppe, brought new ideas and new materials and new possibilities into contact with the existing traditions of the Greek world. The exchange was not one-directional. Greek culture absorbed as it spread, incorporating artistic motifs and philosophical ideas and religious practices from the peoples it encountered, transforming them into something distinctively Greek in the process, just as it transformed the landscapes it settled. In the eastern Aegean, along the coast of Anatolia and on the nearby islands, a group of Greek-speaking communities known collectively as Ionia was developing into one of the most intellectually fertile regions of the archaic world. The Ionian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Samos, Chios, and others, were prosperous trading communities, well connected to the broader world through both sea routes and their proximity to the great civilizations of the Near East. It was in this environment of contact and exchange, in this liminal zone between the Greek world and the older civilizations to the east, that the first stirrings of what we now call philosophy, the love of wisdom, the systematic inquiry into the nature of things, began to be felt. The men we call the pre-Socratic philosophers, pre-Socratic in the sense of having lived and thought before Socrates, though Socrates himself belongs to the later classical period, were a diverse group, connected more by a common impulse than by a shared doctrine. What they shared was a disposition to ask, in a careful and systematic way, questions about the fundamental nature of the world. What is the world made of? What is the underlying substance or principle from which all the apparent diversity of things arises? How does change occur? What is the relationship between the many things we observe and whatever unity might lie beneath them? Thales of Miletus, who lived in the early 6th century BCE and is often counted as the first of the philosophers in the Western tradition, proposed that the fundamental substance of all things was water. That water, in its various transformations, underlay all the apparent diversity of the material world. The specific answer he gave matters less, in a way, than the form of the question itself. Thales was not appealing to the will of the gods, not explaining the nature of the world through mythology, not invoking the intervention of divine powers to account for natural phenomena. He was proposing a natural explanation, an explanation in terms of a substance and its properties for the fundamental character of reality. This move from mythological to naturalistic explanation is one of the most significant intellectual transitions in human history, and it happened here, in the warm and prosperous cities of Ionian Anatolia, in the early morning light of the archaic period. Anaximander, a student of Thales, went further. He proposed that the fundamental substance was not water or any other specific material thing, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless, the indefinite, the infinite, a principle from which all definite things arose, and to which they would all eventually return. The fragmentary sentence that survives from his writing is among the oldest pieces of philosophical prose in the Greek tradition, and it has a quality of quiet profundity about it even across the great distance of time and translation. Anaximenes, another Milesian, proposed air as the fundamental substance, and suggested that the various things of the world arose from air through processes of condensation and rarefaction, thickening and thinning, the world produced by the varying density of a single medium. Further along the Ionian coast, on the island of Samos, Pythagoras was born, though he would spend his adult life in southern Italy, where he founded a community of followers devoted to a way of life organized around mathematical and philosophical inquiry. The Pythagoreans, for it was more a movement than an individual achievement, proposed that the fundamental nature of reality was mathematical, that number and proportion and ratio underlay the apparent diversity of the world and expressed its deepest order. The discovery that the relationships between musical harmonics could be expressed in simple numerical ratios, that the octave corresponded to a ratio of 2 to 1, the fifth to 3-2, the fourth to 4-3, was, in the Pythagorean tradition, a revelation of the deepest kind, a glimpse of the mathematical order hidden within the sensory world. Heraclitus of Ephesus, writing in the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, proposed a vision of reality in which change and opposition were not problems to be explained away, but the fundamental character of existence. Everything flows, he said, or is said to have said, the exact words being uncertain. You cannot step into the same river twice. The world is a unity of opposites, held in a tension that is itself the source of all order and life. Heraclitus wrote in a style that was dense and gnomic, full of compressed images and deliberate paradoxes, and his words, surviving only in fragments, quoted by later authors, have the quality of stones that have been worn smooth by long handling, each one compact and dense, and full of a compressed significance that resists easy paraphrase. While these early philosophers were beginning to think about the nature of the world in new ways, the poets of the archaic period were exploring the nature of human experience with an intensity and a directness that is still moving to encounter. The long tradition of epic poetry, the tradition that had produced the Iliad and the Odyssey, was now joined by newer forms. The lyric poets of the archaic period, Sappho of Lesbos, Alcaeus, Archilochus, Pindar, Simonides, and many others, wrote shorter poems, more personal poems, poems that spoke in a direct first-person voice about love and longing and grief, and the pleasures of wine and the beauty of the physical world. Sappho of Lesbos is among the most affecting of these voices. She lived on the island of Lesbos, off the Ionian coast, sometime in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, and the fragments of her poetry that survive, and they are largely fragments, preserved in quotations by later authors or recovered in small scraps of papyrus from the dry sands of Egypt, are among the most intimate and precise evocations of emotional experience in the ancient world. Her poems speak of desire with a particularity and a vulnerability that feels, even across the enormous distance of time and translation, entirely present and alive. The famous fragment describing the physical symptoms of desire, the tongue broken, the subtle fire running beneath the skin, the eyes seeing nothing, the ears hearing only a roaring, is a piece of writing of such concentrated precision that it has never quite been equaled in its specific aim. Meanwhile, in the Peloponnese, the city of Sparta was developing along lines that were, in many ways, the opposite of the Ionian and Athenian trajectories. Where Ionia was producing philosophers and lyric poets, where Athens was developing its commercial economy and its political institutions, Sparta was organizing itself around the demands of military excellence in a way that would shape its character for centuries. The Spartan system, the agoge, the rigorous training program through which Spartan boys were transformed into soldiers, the common messes where Spartan men ate together regardless of wealth, the unusual degree of freedom and physical training given to Spartan women, the dual kingship and the council of elders and the assembly, and the ephors who held the balance of power. All of this was, by the archaic period, already in place or taking shape, producing a community that was in many ways extraordinary and in other ways deeply constrained. The Olympic Games, which tradition dated to 776 BCE, making that year, in the later Greek reckoning, the first year of recorded history, the beginning of the chronological system based on Olympiads, were another of the great archaic institutions that bound the scattered and diverse communities of the Greek world into something, if not quite a nation, then at least a recognizable common culture. The games were held every 4 years at Olympia in the western Peloponnese, in a broad and pleasant valley where the Alpheus and Cladios rivers met, in the shade of ancient trees, in a sacred precinct dedicated to Zeus. For the duration of the games, a sacred truce was declared. Hostilities between polis were to be suspended. Travelers on their way to and from the games were to be left unmolested. Athletes came from across the Greek world, from the mainland polis and from the Ionian cities, and from the colonies of the West and the Black Sea, to compete in the running events, the wrestling and boxing and pancration, the chariot races. The victor at the Olympic Games received a simple crown of olive leaves, cut from a sacred tree within the precinct. But the honor attached to this simple crown was enormous, reverberating through the winner's lifetime and beyond, celebrated in odes and commemorated in statues, and remembered in the oral traditions of the victor's community for generations. The games were not merely an athletic competition. They were a festival of Greek identity, a periodic gathering at which the scattered and often quarrelsome communities of the Greek world were reminded of what they shared: a language, a religion, a set of aesthetic values, a common way of understanding what it meant to be excellent, to be beautiful, to be worthy of the regard of both human communities and the gods who watched over them. The Kouros and Kori statues that were being produced across the Greek world during this period, those standing figures of young men and young women, carved in marble with an increasing technical refinement and a gradually deepening understanding of the human form, were offerings to the gods, markers of graves, expressions of an aesthetic ideal that was, over the course of the archaic period, becoming steadily more naturalistic, more attentive to the specific and particular qualities of the human body. The earliest kouri are stiff and frontal, their forms derived from Egyptian models, their fists held at their sides, their left foot slightly advanced in a stance borrowed from the sculpture of the great civilization to the south. But over the course of the 7th and 6th centuries, the Kouros type evolves, the muscles become more accurately observed, the hair more carefully rendered, the face softer and more individualized, marked by the characteristic expression that modern scholars call the archaic smile, that slight upward curve of the lips that seems to express not amusement exactly, but a kind of serene and inward self-possession, a quality of existing fully within the moment without strain or anxiety. These statues stood in the sanctuaries of the gods, in the groves of olive trees, and beside the clear springs that marked the sacred spaces of the Greek world, weathering slowly in the sun and rain, their marble surfaces gradually losing the paint that once covered them. For they were painted, these statues, their hair and eyes and lips and clothing rendered in color, so that they would have appeared to contemporary eyes not as the cool white figures we encounter in museums, but as vivid, almost living presences. The paint has gone now, washed away by the long passage of time, leaving the white marble that feels so appropriate to our idea of the classical, but was not, in fact, what the Greeks saw when they looked at their own sacred images. As the archaic period moved toward its close, toward the early decades of the 5th century BCE, the Greek world was more complex, more connected, more culturally rich, and in many ways more politically diverse than it had ever been. The polis had developed their characteristic institutions and their characteristic rivalries. The philosophical tradition was gathering momentum. The poetic tradition was flourishing in multiple forms. The visual arts were in the middle of a long development that would eventually produce the classical style. The colonies had spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean, and the world beyond Greece, the world of the great Persian Empire, which had been expanding steadily westward under Cyrus and Cambyses and Darius, was taking an increasing interest in the Greek cities of Ionia, which lay within the Persian sphere of influence, and through them, in the Greek world more broadly. That encounter with Persia, the great test that the archaic period bequeathed to the classical, was still just gathering on the horizon, still a distant thing, like weather visible far out at sea on an otherwise calm and quiet afternoon. But it was coming, moving slowly across the water, and its coming would, in ways that no one could yet fully anticipate, change everything. The waking of the city-states had been a long and gradual process, full of the slow accumulation of ideas and institutions and habits of mind and ways of seeing the world. What was coming would test all of that accumulation in ways that the archaic period, for all its remarkable fertility, had not yet imagined. But that testing was still ahead, still waiting in the warm haze of an as yet unlived morning. For now, the cities were simply awake and full, and turning toward the light with the unhurried confidence of things that have been growing for a very long time and are finally, fully themselves. There is a particular quality to the middle of a long, warm afternoon, when the light has reached its fullest and most generous expression, and the air is still, and the shadows have grown short, and everything seems to pause, to hold itself in a moment of maximum presence before the slow decline toward evening begins. This is the quality that clings to the classical period of ancient Greece in the historical imagination, a sense of fullness, of things having reached their most complete and luminous expression, of a civilization existing at the height of its particular flowering. The 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, stretching from the great Persian wars at the beginning of the 5th century, through the conquests of Alexander the Great at the end of the 4th, are the centuries that have most shaped the Western world's understanding of what ancient Greece was and what it meant. They are the centuries of the Parthenon and of Socrates, of Sophocles and Thucydides and Plato, of democracy in Athens, and of the long, exhausting war that would eventually drain that democracy of much of its vitality. They are, in the common understanding, the golden hours of Greek civilization. And yet, as with all golden hours, the light they cast was not uniform. It fell differently on different places, on different people, on different aspects of a world that was, even at its most luminous, deeply complicated and deeply contradictory. The Athens that produced Sophocles and Plato also produced the slave markets at the Piraeus, where human beings were bought and sold as casually as pottery. The democracy that gave the citizens of Athens a degree of political participation, unparalleled in the ancient world, rested on the exclusion of women, of slaves, of foreigners, of the majority of the people who actually lived within the city's walls. The architectural perfection of the Parthenon was funded in part by the tribute extracted from the subjectiles of the Athenian Empire. The golden hours, like all hours, contained within them the full complexity of human life, its beauty and its cruelty, its aspiration and its failure, its moments of genuine transcendence and its long stretches of ordinary suffering. It is worth holding all of this together, gently, without either dismissing the genuine achievements of the period or sentimentalizing them into something simpler than they were. The beginning of the classical period is conventionally placed at the Persian Wars, the series of conflicts between the expanding Persian Empire and the Greek polis that unfolded in the early decades of the 5th century BCE. The Persian Empire, by this point the largest political entity the world had yet seen, stretching from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean coast in the west, had absorbed the Greek cities of Ionia into its administrative structure during the latter part of the 6th century, under Cyrus, and then Cambyses, and then Darius. The Ionian Greeks had not been entirely comfortable subjects. In 499 BCE, the Ionian cities rose in rebellion against Persian rule, a rebellion that Athens and the small city of Eretria on the island of Euboea chose to support by sending ships and men to assist the rebels. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but the Persian king Darius did not forget the intervention of the mainland Greeks, and the stage was set for a response. That response came in 490 BCE, when a Persian force crossed the Aegean and landed at the Bay of Marathon, on the northeastern coast of Attica, the territory of Athens. The Athenian army, smaller than the Persian force it faced, marched out to meet the invaders on the plain below the hills, and in the engagement that followed, the Athenians won a victory that would reverberate through Greek memory for generations. The Battle of Marathon, fought in the warm late summer of that distant year, on a plain that still exists, still quiet and agricultural, the hills behind it still covered in the same low scrub, became one of the founding moments of Athenian and, more broadly, Greek identity. The men who fought there, the Marathonomachi, were remembered with a particular reverence that outlasted the normal span of individual memory. They had stood against the greatest empire in the world and prevailed, and that fact, or rather, the meaning that accumulated around that fact over the years and decades that followed, shaped the way Athens understood itself, its power, its destiny, its relationship to the gods who had seemingly favored it on that warm September morning. 10 years later, the Persians returned, this time under Darius's son Xerxes, with a force so large that the ancient sources describe it in numbers that are certainly exaggerated, but that capture something true about the scale of the enterprise. An army drawn from dozens of peoples across the vast empire, supported by a fleet that darkened the sea. The Greeks who chose to resist this overwhelming force formed a coalition, loose and imperfect and fractious, held together by the immediate necessity of the threat and the somewhat more durable fact of shared language and shared religion. Sparta, with its formidable army, provided the nominal leadership of the land forces. Athens, which had in the intervening decade built a large fleet on the advice of the politician and general Themistocles, contributed the greatest naval strength. The resistance began at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, where a small force of Greeks, including 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas, held the Persian advance for several days, buying time that would prove valuable even as the position was ultimately turned by a path through the mountains revealed to the Persians by a local man, forcing the Greek position to collapse. Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, along with several hundred Thespians and others who chose to remain, died at Thermopylae in an engagement whose memory has been extraordinarily persistent, more persistent, perhaps, than its immediate military significance might seem to warrant. What made it memorable was not the outcome, which was a defeat, but the quality of the choice. To stand and die in a position known to be untenable, for the sake of values, honor, duty, the protection of one's community that were, in the Greek understanding, worth dying for. The Spartan epitaph, composed by the poet Simonides and preserved in the ancient tradition, is among the most compressed and resonant pieces of Greek writing. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here Obedient to their words we lie. The Persian advance continued. Athens was evacuated, the population carried across to the island of Salamis and the shores of the Argolid by the Athenian fleet, while the Persians entered the empty city and burned the temples on the Acropolis, whose smoke could be seen from the decks of the Athenian ships in the straits nearby. And then, in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, the Greek fleet, mainly Athenian, engaged the Persian navy in a battle that turned the tide of the war. The Persian fleet, too large for the confined waters and hampered by the unfamiliarity of its captains with the local conditions, was damaged severely enough that Xerxes, watching from a throne set up on a headland above the straits, chose to withdraw the main body of his fleet to safer waters. The land army, left in Greece over the winter under the general Mardonius, was defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea, and the threat of Persian conquest receded. The aftermath of the Persian Wars changed the Greek world in ways that would define the classical period. Athens emerged from the wars with an enormous sense of its own significance, its own power, its own destiny. The city had been burned, its temples destroyed, its population displaced, and yet it had survived and prevailed, and in prevailing, it had demonstrated something that seemed to its citizens of profound importance, that a community of free citizens, governing themselves, fighting for their own land and their own institutions, could overcome a force that was, in material terms, vastly superior. The democracy of Athens, introduced in its essential form by the reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BCE, just 2 years before the Ionian Revolt, was validated by the Persian Wars in the minds of Athenians, associated with the military victories that had saved the city, given a moral weight and a legitimacy that it might otherwise have taken much longer to acquire. The democracy that Cleisthenes had established and that the Persian Wars had validated was a remarkable institution, though it is important to understand what it was and what it was not. It was a direct democracy, not representative in the modern sense, not a system in which citizens chose leaders to make decisions on their behalf, but a system in which the citizens themselves, gathered in assembly, debated and voted on the major decisions of the community. Any male citizen of Athens, and citizenship was restricted to men of Athenian parentage on both sides, excluding women, slaves, freed slaves, and the large population of resident foreigners called metics, could speak in the assembly, could propose measures, could vote on legislation and foreign policy and the appointment of generals. The assembly met regularly on the slope of a hill called the Pnyx, in the open air, the city visible below and the sea visible beyond it, and the voice of the people, or the voice of those who had the time and the inclination to attend, was, in principle, the source of all public authority. The courts of Athens were similarly constructed around the idea of popular participation. Large juries of citizen jurors decided cases by majority vote, without a judge in the modern sense to direct them toward legally correct conclusions. The juries were large, 500 was a common number, and some juries were larger, both to make bribery impractical and to ensure that the verdict represented something like a genuine cross-section of citizen opinion. The legal arguments made before these large juries were public performances in a quite literal sense, heard by hundreds of people who might subsequently discuss them in the agora and repeat them to their neighbors, contributing to the enormous importance of rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking, in Athenian public life. In the decades following the Persian Wars, Athens also became the center of an empire, though the Athenians preferred not to call it that. The Delian League, formed in the immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars as a defensive alliance of Greek polis against the possibility of further Persian aggression, had its treasury on the sacred island of Delos and was organized around Athenian naval power. Over the decades that followed, Athens gradually transformed this voluntary alliance into something closer to an empire, moving the treasury from Delos to Athens, using the accumulated tribute of the allied polis to fund Athenian building projects and Athenian festivals and Athenian public life, and making it increasingly clear that the allied polis had little practical freedom to withdraw from the arrangement or to challenge Athenian leadership within it. The Athenian Empire was a source of wealth and of resentment in roughly equal measure, and both the wealth and the resentment would shape the history of the classical period. The wealth funded what is perhaps the most visible legacy of classical Athens, the building program of Pericles, the dominant political figure of the Athenian democracy in the middle decades of the 5th century BCE. Pericles, who was not a king or a tyrant but a democratically elected general, who maintained his influence through the quality of his speeches and the force of his personality, directed the resources of the Athenian state and its empire toward the transformation of the Acropolis into the architectural ensemble that still dominates the Athens skyline. The Parthenon, the great temple of Athena Parthenos, the Virgin Athena, patron of the city, was built between 447 and 432 BCE, under the direction of the architects Ictinus and Callicrates and the sculptor Pheidias, who oversaw the decorative program and created the colossal chryselephantine statue of Athena that stood within the temple, her skin of ivory and her armor and clothing of gold, her eyes perhaps of glass or precious stone. Her presence filling the interior of the building with a quality that the ancient sources suggest was overwhelming, was beyond ordinary experience. The Parthenon is, even in its present ruined state, even stripped of its sculpture and its paint and its roof and its great statue, a building of extraordinary presence. It sits on the highest point of the Acropolis rock, visible from most of the city below and from the sea beyond, its columns of Pentelic marble, a marble of unusual quality, faintly warm in color, with a slight golden tint that intensifies in certain lights, rising against the sky in a proportion that seems, even now, to express something about the relationship between human aspiration and natural order. The architects of the Parthenon incorporated into its design a series of subtle optical refinements, slight curvatures in the floor and the entablature, slight inward inclinations of the columns, slight thickenings in the columns at their midpoints, that prevent the eye from experiencing the rigid horizontals and verticals of a purely rectilinear building, and give the whole structure a quality of gentle animation, as though the building were very slightly alive, very slightly breathing, adjusting itself to the light and the air around it. The sculpture of the Parthenon, the 92 metopes carved in high relief around the exterior, the long frieze carved in low relief running around the top of the inner building, the great pediment groups that filled the triangular spaces at either end, was, in its original state, one of the most ambitious sculptural programs ever attempted. The frieze, running 160 meters around the building, depicted the Panathenaic procession, the great civic and religious festival of Athens, in which the citizens marched up to the Acropolis to present Athena with a new robe. It is a deeply unusual subject for temple decoration, which more commonly depicted mythological scenes. The presence of ordinary Athenian citizens riding their horses, leading their sacrificial animals, carrying their offerings, on the walls of the great temple of the city's patron deity says something about the particular character of Athenian piety in the classical period, about the way in which religious devotion and civic pride had become, in Athens, almost impossible to separate. Pericles, who was the political embodiment of this confident and expansive Athenian self-understanding, gave an oration at the public funeral of the Athenian war dead that was recorded, or perhaps recreated, in the manner of ancient historians by Thucydides, and that has served ever since as one of the most eloquent expressions of the Athenian democratic ideal. In this speech, Pericles described Athens as an education to Greece, a model of how a free community of equal citizens could govern itself and create beauty and pursue excellence in all the things that make human life worth living. The speech is an extraordinary document, confident, generous in its vision, precise in its articulation of the values that Athenian democracy was meant to embody. It is also a speech given at a funeral, at a time when Athens was already engaged in the long and terrible war that would, in the end, exhaust and diminish it. There is something quietly poignant about this, about the clarity and confidence of the vision set against the dark circumstances of its delivery. The Peloponnesian War, the great conflict between Athens and Sparta, and their respective allies that occupied much of the last third of the 5th century BCE, from 431 to 404, was the shadow that fell across the golden afternoon of classical Athens. Its causes were complex and have been debated by historians from Thucydides himself down to the present. But in broad terms, they involved the growing tension between the Athenian Empire and the powers that felt threatened by Athenian expansion, Sparta chief among them. Sparta, with its powerful land army and its deeply conservative political culture, watched the growth of Athenian wealth and Athenian influence with a concern that was understandable, even if the war that grew from that concern was, in the end, destructive for both sides and for the Greek world more broadly. Thucydides, the Athenian historian who wrote the account of the war that remains the primary source for most of its events, was himself a participant in the early years of the conflict, serving as a general until a military failure resulted in his exile from Athens. He spent the rest of the war in a kind of enforced detachment, traveling, gathering information, thinking with great precision about the nature of power and the behavior of states, and the relationship between professed principles and actual motivations. The history he produced is unlike anything else in the ancient world, a work of rigorous analytical intelligence, of scrupulous attention to evidence, of a deep and somewhat dark understanding of the forces that drive political communities toward conflict and the ways in which those communities deceive themselves about their own motives. Thucydides believed that his history would be useful to future generations, not because the specific events it described would recur, but because human nature being what it is, the kinds of dynamics it traced, the growth of fear and ambition, the degeneration of political language, the cruelty that communities are capable of when they feel sufficiently threatened or sufficiently powerful, would recur, in different forms in different places, again and again. The war itself was long and grueling, and in the end, inconclusive in many of its early phases before becoming decisive in its later ones. It opened with Spartan invasions of Attica, the territory of Athens, that ravaged the agricultural land and drove the rural population behind the long walls connecting Athens to its harbor at the Piraeus. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battle with the Spartan army, which was superior, and to use Athenian naval power to raid the coasts of the Peloponnese and maintain the flow of tribute from the empire. It was a strategy that might have worked over the long term, but in the second year of the war, a plague arrived in the crowded city, probably, though not certainly, a form of typhus, though the precise identification remains uncertain, and swept through the population with devastating effect. Pericles himself died of the plague in 429, and with him died something of the particular kind of steady, far-sighted leadership that his long political career had provided. The decades that followed were marked by the competitive democracy that Thucydides observed with such cold precision. The rise of demagogues, politicians who used the assembly's direct power less to serve the common good than to advance their own positions, appealing to the immediate desires and fears of the citizen body rather than to its longer-term interests. The most characteristic, and in many ways the most fascinating of these figures was Alcibiades. Brilliant, physically beautiful, morally unscrupulous, capable of extraordinary political and military insight and equally extraordinary betrayal. The kind of figure who seems to embody in his own person all the contradictions of the society that produced him. It was Alcibiades who championed the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic enterprise of the war, the Sicilian expedition of 415 BCE, in which Athens sent an enormous armada, hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers and sailors, against the distant city of Syracuse in Sicily, in an attempt to extend Athenian power into the western Mediterranean. The Sicilian expedition ended in complete disaster. The fleet was destroyed. The army was captured and died in the stone quarries of Syracuse. It was one of the most complete military catastrophes in Athenian history, and it tipped the balance of the war in ways that Athens was never fully able to recover from. The remaining years of the conflict saw Sparta, with Persian financial support that funded the construction of a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval supremacy, gradually wearing down Athenian power until, in 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down. The fleet was reduced to a token force. A pro-Spartan oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants, was installed, though it lasted only briefly before being overthrown and democracy restored. Athens recovered in the following decades with a resilience that is itself remarkable. The democracy was restored, the economy rebuilt. The cultural life of the city continued to flourish in forms that were different from but continuous with what had come before. But something had changed. The confidence, the expansiveness, the sense of unlimited possibility that had characterized the high classical period was tempered now by the experience of the war and its aftermath, by the knowledge that great ambitions could lead to great disasters. That power was not self-sustaining, that even the most apparently secure and flourishing community was subject to the same forces of change and decay that governed all things. It was in this atmosphere, chastened, more reflective, still intellectually alive but differently alive than before, that the figure of Socrates moved through the streets and gymnasiums and symposia of Athens, asking his patient, uncomfortable questions. Socrates wrote nothing. What we know of him comes primarily from the dialogues of Plato, his most famous student, and from the memoir of Xenophon, another of his associates. He was an old man by the end of the 5th century, short and physically unprepossessing by the standards of Greek beauty, but possessed of a quality of presence and intelligence that drew to him some of the most gifted and ambitious young men of Athens. His method was conversation, long, winding, patient conversation in which he professed ignorance and asked questions, and drew his interlocutors into the discovery of their own uncertainties, into the recognition that the things they had assumed they knew, justice, piety, courage, beauty, were, on examination, far more difficult to define and understand than they had imagined. In 399 BCE, Socrates was tried before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. He was found guilty by a narrow margin and condemned to death, dying by drinking hemlock in the company of his friends, discussing with them, in his characteristic way, the question of whether the soul survived the death of the body. The trial and death of Socrates is one of the most discussed events in the history of Western philosophy, and its meaning has been interpreted in many different ways: as a failure of Athenian democracy, as a tragedy of misunderstanding, as the inevitable collision between a genuinely philosophical temperament and the demands of a community that found his questions threatening. Whatever its meaning, it produced a deep effect on Plato, who was present at the trial and who devoted much of his subsequent life and work to the attempt to capture something of Socrates in writing, and to pursue, in his own way and with his own extraordinary philosophical gifts, the questions that Socrates had raised. Plato's dialogues, 36 works of extraordinary literary and philosophical quality, spanning the full range of philosophical inquiry from ethics to metaphysics to political philosophy to epistemology, are among the most sustained and influential intellectual achievements of the ancient world. His theory of forms, the proposal that the world of sensory experience is a shadow or reflection of a higher reality of eternal, unchanging, perfectly real entities of which particular things are imperfect copies, has been one of the most productive and disputed ideas in the history of philosophy. His political philosophy, worked out most fully in the Republic, imagines a community organized according to principles of justice and reason, governed by those who have achieved philosophical understanding of the good, a vision that is both deeply compelling and, in certain of its details, deeply troubling, and that has generated argument and response across 2,500 years. Plato's student Aristotle was, if anything, even more comprehensive in the scope of his intellectual ambitions, writing with authority and profundity on logic, biology, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and poetics, producing a body of work so vast and so systematically organized that it would serve, in the medieval period, as the framework for an entire civilization's understanding of the natural and human worlds. Aristotle was more empirical than his teacher, more interested in the particular and the observable, less drawn to the abstractions of the theory of forms. His politics were more practical than Plato's. He collected and analyzed the constitutions of 158 Greek polis in preparation for his treatise on politics, an empirical approach to political philosophy that has remained influential. The 4th century BCE, which saw the full flowering of this philosophical tradition, also saw the gradual exhaustion of the polis system itself, the slow revelation that the system of independent city-states, each pursuing its own interests with a jealousy and a competitive energy that had been so productive in the archaic and early classical periods, could not sustain itself indefinitely in the face of the cumulative costs of the warfare that the same competitive energy generated. Sparta's dominance after the Peloponnesian War was resented and resisted. Thebes rose to prominence under the brilliant general Epaminondas and defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, breaking the myth of Spartan invincibility. But Theban dominance was equally resented, and Epaminondas himself died at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, and with him died the Theban hegemony. The polis were exhausting each other and themselves, and the world beyond Greece to the north, in Macedonia, was watching. The golden afternoon was drawing toward its close. The light was still warm, still beautiful, still falling on the pale marble of the temples, and the gray-green of the olive trees, and the bright blue of the sea with all the generosity it had always had. But the shadows were lengthening now, moving slowly across the hillsides in the unhurried way that all shadows move, and the air was beginning to carry the first hint of the evening coolness that would follow. The philosophers were still thinking, the playwrights still writing, the sculptors still at their work in the warm marble dust of their workshops. The world was still full of thought and beauty, and the patient inquiry into what it meant to live a good human life. But the particular configuration of that world, the polis, the democracy, the small and fiercely independent community of citizens governing themselves, was passing into a new phase, a new arrangement of power that would carry something of all that had come before into a wider world, a more distant horizon, a larger and more complex and in some ways lonelier space. The golden hours had been real and full and extraordinary. And now, with the same gentle inevitability with which all such hours pass, they were fading into the long, still evening. There is a particular beauty to the evening hours, when the light has left its midday intensity and settled into something softer and more diffuse, when the colors of the landscape deepen rather than bleach, when the shadows are long and the air carries the accumulated warmth of the day in a way that feels, somehow, more intimate than the heat of noon. This is the quality of the last great phase of ancient Greek history, the Hellenistic period and its slow, gradual absorption into the Roman world, a phase that is sometimes treated as a diminishment, as a falling away from the classical heights, but that was in its own way a remarkable era, full of its own particular achievements and its own distinctive beauty, a beauty that belongs to evening rather than to midday, to expansion rather than concentration, to the long and quiet spreading of things across a wider world, rather than their intense flowering in a single place. The man who made this spreading possible was born in 356 BCE in the Kingdom of Macedonia, to the north of the Greek peninsula proper, a region that the Greeks of the southern polis regarded with a certain condescension, as a place that was Greek in language and in certain cultural affinities, but not quite Greek in the full sense, not organized into polis, not possessed of the civic institutions and the philosophical traditions that the Athenians and the Corinthians and the Spartans considered the hallmarks of true civilization. His name was Alexander, and he would be called the Great, though the greatness attached to his name has always been a complicated kind of greatness, inseparable from a scale of violence and disruption that the word great tends to obscure. His father was Philip II of Macedonia, a king of considerable intelligence and military genius, who had spent the years of his reign transforming the Macedonian army into the most effective fighting force in the Greek world, and gradually extending Macedonian power southward into the peninsula, until at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, he defeated a coalition of Greek polies, Athens and Thebes chief among them, and established Macedonian supremacy over the Greek world. Philip's Macedonia was not the rough and peripheral place that southern Greek condescension imagined it to be. The Macedonian court at Pella was a place of genuine cultural sophistication, where Greek language and Greek literature and Greek art were cultivated with real seriousness. Philip himself was educated in the Greek manner. He brought Aristotle to his court to serve as tutor to his son Alexander, an arrangement that has always fascinated those who think about the history of ideas. The greatest philosopher of the ancient world shaping the mind of the man who would do more than anyone else to spread Greek culture across the known world. What exactly Aristotle taught Alexander, and what Alexander absorbed and retained from those lessons, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Alexander grew up bilingual in Macedonian and Greek, deeply familiar with the Homeric poems. He slept, it is said, with a copy of the Iliad and a dagger under his pillow, and possessed of a quality of intelligence and energy and physical courage that set him apart from almost everyone around him. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE by one of his own bodyguards, in circumstances that have never been entirely explained, Alexander was 20 years old. He moved quickly to secure his position, eliminating rival claimants and reasserting Macedonian authority over the Greek polies that had stirred in the hope that Philip's death might give them back their freedom. By 334 BCE, he was ready to turn east, to carry out the long-discussed and long-prepared campaign against the Persian Empire that his father had planned, and that Alexander would execute with a speed and thoroughness that left the ancient world, and has left historians ever since, in a state of quiet astonishment. The campaign began with the crossing of the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, the same body of water that Xerxes had crossed in the opposite direction 150 years before, when the Persian king had led his vast army into Greece. Alexander crossed with an army of perhaps 35,000 men, Macedonian infantry and cavalry, supplemented by contingents from the Greek polies, and paused at Troy, at the ruins of the city that Homer had made famous, to make offerings at the tomb traditionally identified as that of Achilles. It was a characteristic gesture, full of the theatrical self-consciousness that ran through all of Alexander's public actions, the deliberate alignment of himself with the heroic tradition, the claim to be enacting in the real world the kind of deeds that Homer had celebrated in verse. The battles that followed, Granicus in 334, Issus in 333, Gaugamela in 331, were each in their own way decisive, each a demonstration of the tactical flexibility and the personal courage that characterized Alexander's generalship. At the Granicus River, the Macedonian army crossed under fire and broke the Persian defensive position. At Issus, on the narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea in what is now southern Turkey, Alexander defeated the Persian king Darius III in person, Darius fleeing the field, while his family was captured by the advancing Macedonians and treated, by Alexander, with a courtesy that was both genuinely humane and carefully calculated to project an image of royal magnanimity. At Gaugamela, on a broad open plain in what is now northern Iraq, Darius assembled his largest force and chose his ground with care, but Alexander's oblique attack and his own bold charge into the center of the Persian line broke the formation and sent Darius fleeing again, this time fatally. He was murdered by his own subordinates as he fled, leaving Alexander to present himself as the legitimate heir to the Persian throne, the rightful king of Asia, the avenger of the wrongs done to Greece. The cities fell in sequence, each one distinct, each one carrying its own weight of history and its own particular quality of place. Sardis, the old Lydian capital that had been a Persian administrative center. Ephesus, the great Ionian city with its enormous temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, its columns still rising in the warm Anatolian air. Gaza, which resisted and was taken after a siege. Egypt, which received Alexander almost as a liberator, welcoming him to the ancient city of Memphis, and then following him westward along the Mediterranean coast to the spot where he chose to found a new city, Alexandria, named for himself, built on a narrow strip of land between the sea and the great lake of Marriott, planned with a regularity and an ambition that spoke of the new kind of world Alexander intended to create. Alexandria would become, in the following centuries, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of trade and scholarship and cultural mixing, whose library would attempt, with a characteristic Hellenistic ambition, to collect all the knowledge of the world in one place. From Egypt, Alexander turned east again, pursuing Darius and then, after Darius's death, continuing eastward into the vast Iranian plateau, into the ancient lands of Persia proper, where he burned the great palace of Persepolis. Whether deliberately as a symbolic act or in the course of a drunken celebration, the ancient sources disagree, and then pressed on further still, into the remote mountain landscapes of Bactria and Sogdiana. In what is now Afghanistan and the neighboring republics of Central Asia, these campaigns in the Far East were harder, slower, more grinding than the swift victories of the West. The terrain was difficult. The enemy fought differently, using the landscape with a flexibility that the Persian imperial armies had not employed. And Alexander's men were tired, far from home, in a world that felt increasingly remote from anything they recognized. It was here, in these remote eastern landscapes, that Alexander began to change in ways that disturbed his Macedonian officers. He adopted elements of Persian court ceremonial, wearing Persian dress on occasion, introducing the practice of proskenses, the prostration before the king that was normal in the Persian court, but that Greeks and Macedonians found degrading, associated in their minds with the submission appropriate to slaves rather than free men. He married Roxane, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, in what appears to have been a genuine attachment as well as a political alliance. He killed, in moments of rage that he afterwards deeply regretted, men who had been his companions from youth, Cletus the Black, who had once saved his life at the Granicus, died at Alexander's hand during a drunken quarrel. These events suggest something about the psychological costs of the extraordinary enterprise Alexander was engaged in, the isolation that comes with absolute power, the difficulty of maintaining any stable sense of self when one's identity had become as large and as complicated as Alexander's had become. The eastward movement continued until it reached India. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush and descended into the Punjab, where at the Hydaspes River he fought his last great pitched battle against the Indian king Porus, whose forces included war elephants that the Macedonian cavalry horses found deeply unsettling. The battle was won, but after it, Alexander's army refused to go further. They were, by this point, 8 years from home, at the edge of the world as they understood it, and they had had enough. Alexander, for whom enough was always a concept of uncertain relevance, was frustrated, but he acquiesced, and the long return began, a journey westward through the harsh deserts of Makran that cost the army dearly, and then northward through Persia, and finally back to Babylon, the ancient city in Mesopotamia that Alexander had chosen as the capital of his new empire. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32. The cause of his death has been debated since antiquity: fever, possibly typhoid or West Nile virus, possibly complicated by the effects of heavy drinking and the accumulated wounds of a decade of constant campaigning. He died without having designated a clear successor, and when his generals gathered around him in his final hours and asked to whom he left his empire, the tradition records that he said simply, "To the strongest." It was, if he said it, a typically laconic and a typically devastating answer, an acknowledgement that what he had created could not survive his death intact, that the empire built around a single extraordinary personality had no institutional basis that could sustain it without that personality at its center. The wars of succession that followed, the conflicts among Alexander's generals, the diadachi or successors, that occupied the half-century after his death, were long and complicated, and in their details difficult to follow. They resulted eventually in the division of the Alexandrian Empire into several successor kingdoms, each ruled by one of the Macedonian dynasties that emerged from the wars of succession. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt from their capital at Alexandria. The Seleucids ruled a vast territory stretching from Syria through Persia to the borders of India, though their hold on the eastern portions of this territory gradually weakened over the following centuries. The Antigonids ruled Macedonia and exercised a varying degree of influence over the Greek polis of the southern peninsula. Smaller kingdoms, Pergamon in western Anatolia, the various kingdoms of the Black Sea coast, carved out their own spaces in the interstices of the larger powers. This is the world historians call Hellenistic, from the Greek word for Greek, Hellenic, with a suffix that suggests the spreading and diffusing of something, the carrying of it into new contexts and new combinations. The Hellenistic world was, in geographical terms, vastly larger than the classical Greek world. It stretched from the western Mediterranean to the borders of India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the cataracts of the Nile. Greek was its common language of culture and administration, not the diverse local dialects of the classical period, but a standardized form called the Koine, the common tongue, spoken and written, across the breadth of the Hellenistic world as a lingua franca that allowed educated people from Alexandria to Antioch to Pergamon to communicate without difficulty. This Koine Greek would later become the language of the New Testament, the medium through which the Christian Gospels would be written and spread across the Mediterranean world. One of the more remarkable long-term consequences of Alexander's campaigns. The Hellenistic period produced a distinctive culture that was neither the culture of classical Greece nor the cultures of the peoples it encountered in Egypt and Persia and the Near East, but something new, a hybrid, a mixing, a slow blending of traditions and ideas and artistic practices that produced results of considerable interest. The city of Alexandria, under the patronage of the Ptolemaic kings, became the greatest center of scholarship and scientific inquiry of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, that legendary institution whose loss is still mourned, though its actual extent and its actual destruction have been considerably mythologized by later tradition, was part of a larger institution called the Mauseon, the Sanctuary of the Muses, a kind of royal research institution where scholars from across the Greek-speaking world were brought together, supported by royal patronage, to pursue their inquiries in whatever direction those inquiries led. The scholarship produced at Alexandria and at other Hellenistic centers of learning was remarkable in its range and in its ambition. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry there, the systematic presentation of mathematical knowledge that would serve as the foundation of mathematical education in the Western world for 2,000 years, still being read and studied in schools well into the 19th century. Archimedes of Syracuse, though not Alexandrian himself, worked in the broader Hellenistic tradition of mathematical and scientific inquiry, making contributions to geometry and to the understanding of physical principles. The lever, the screw, the properties of floating bodies, that were of both theoretical and practical significance. Eratosthenes, the librarian of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, calculated the circumference of the earth with a method of considerable elegance and a result of considerable accuracy, using the difference in the angle of the sun's shadow between Alexandria and Aswan at the summer solstice to determine the curvature of the earth's surface. Aristarchus of Samos proposed in the 3rd century BCE that the earth moved around the sun rather than the sun around the earth, a heliocentric hypothesis that was not accepted by the majority of ancient astronomers, who found it difficult to reconcile with the observed behavior of the stars. But that was not forgotten either, preserved in the tradition and eventually retrieved in the 16th century CE by Copernicus, who acknowledged his debt to Aristarchus. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century BCE, made systematic observations of the stars and planets and produced a star catalogue of remarkable accuracy, developing the system of stellar magnitudes that is still in use today, and discovering the slow wobble in the Earth's axis known as the precession of the equinoxes. The Hellenistic astronomers were, in their patient and systematic observation of the sky, doing something that feels recognizably modern, using careful measurement and mathematical analysis to understand the physical universe. And they were doing it with a sophistication that would not be surpassed until the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, nearly 2,000 years later. The art of the Hellenistic period moved away from the serene idealism of the classical style toward something more emotionally expressive, more interested in the particular and the individual, more willing to explore extremes of age and feeling that the classical style had largely avoided. The great sculptural groups of the Hellenistic period, the Laocoon, showing the Trojan priest and his sons in the agonizing grip of the serpent sent to destroy them, the dying Gaul, a defeated and dying warrior rendered with a dignity and a pathos that transcends the circumstances of his defeat. The winged victory of Samothrace, her stone drapery blown back by a wind that no longer blows, her headless form still conveying a quality of movement and triumph that is almost physically felt. These works speak of a changed aesthetic sensibility, one that finds beauty in suffering as well as in serenity, that is interested in the drama of the human situation in all its registers, not only in its most elevated and composed expressions. The portraiture of the Hellenistic period similarly moved toward the individual and the particular in ways that the classical period had resisted. Where classical portraiture had tended toward idealization, producing images that expressed a general quality of excellence rather than recording the specific features of a specific face, Hellenistic portraiture could be startlingly direct and particular. Old men with deeply lined faces, philosophers with disheveled hair and the distracted look of deep thought. Kings with specific and sometimes unflattering physical characteristics rendered without apology. The world was becoming more interested in the individual, in the specific person, in what distinguished one human being from another rather than what they shared with an ideal type. In philosophy, the Hellenistic period produced several influential schools of thought, each responding in its own way to the changed circumstances of a world in which the old framework of the polis no longer provided the primary structure of meaning and identity. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium in Athens around the end of the 4th century BCE, taught that virtue was the only true good, that the things that most people pursued, wealth, pleasure, fame, political power, were matters of indifference, neither truly good nor truly bad in themselves, and that the path to a good life lay in conforming one's will to the rational order of the universe, accepting with equanimity whatever that order brought. The Stoic philosophy was well suited to a world in which the individual could no longer shape events through participation in a small and responsive democratic community, a world in which much of what happened to a person was determined by forces far beyond their control. It would prove extraordinarily influential, shaping Roman philosophy, and through Roman philosophy, the ethical thinking of medieval Christianity, and eventually the broader Western tradition. The Epicureans, followers of Epicurus who established his school in a garden in Athens, proposed a different response to the uncertainties of the Hellenistic world. The good life, on the Epicurean view, was a life of moderate pleasure, not the wild indulgence that the word Epicurean has come unfairly to suggest, but the quiet, sustained pleasure of friendship and intellectual conversation and freedom from pain and anxiety. Epicurus taught that the gods, if they existed, took no interest in human affairs, and that death was simply the cessation of sensation. Nothing to be feared, since where death was, one was not, and where one was, death was not. The Epicurean philosophy was, in its own way, a counsel of withdrawal from the overwhelming complexity of the public world, an invitation to find sufficiency in the small and manageable pleasures of the private life, tended like a garden, protected from the storms of political ambition and public anxiety. All of this, the scholarship, the science, the philosophy, the art, the widespread Greek language and Greek culture carried across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East by the Hellenistic kingdoms, was the living inheritance of the long centuries that had preceded it. And all of it was happening against the background of a rising power in the Western Mediterranean that would, gradually and then definitively, absorb the Hellenistic world into itself. Rome, the city on the Tiber in central Italy, had been growing in power and territory throughout the Hellenistic period, extending its control first over the Italian peninsula, and then, through a series of wars with Carthage and with the Hellenistic kingdoms, across the broader Mediterranean world. The absorption of the Greek world by Rome was not sudden. It was a process of generations, a slow incorporation of one world into another, carried out through a combination of military force and diplomatic arrangement, and the gradual integration of Greek territories into the Roman administrative system. The Roman conquest of Macedonia, completed definitively in 168 BCE after the Battle of Pydna, where the last Antigonid king Perseus was defeated, brought the homeland of the Macedonian kingdoms under Roman control. The destruction of Corinth in 146 BCE, the same year as the destruction of Carthage, Rome's great rival in the Western Mediterranean, sent a clear message about the nature of Roman power in the Greek world. The Attalid kingdom of Pergamon was bequeathed to Rome by its last king, Attalus III, in 133 BCE, adding western Anatolia to the Roman sphere. Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, fell to Rome in 30 BCE, when the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium ended the Ptolemaic dynasty and brought the last independent fragment of the Alexandrian inheritance under Roman control. And yet the absorption of Greece by Rome was never simply the replacement of one culture by another. The Romans, who were practical in so many things, were genuinely and deeply impressed by Greek culture, by its philosophy, its literature, its art, its rhetoric, its science, and they approached it not as conquerors approaching a defeated and worthless tradition, but as students, somewhat in awe, somewhat embarrassed by their own awareness of what they had not yet achieved and what the Greeks had. The poet Horace, writing in the 1st century BCE, captured this with characteristic precision when he noted that captive Greece had taken her fierce conqueror captive, bringing the arts to rustic Latium. Greek philosophy was translated into Latin by Cicero and others, making it accessible to the Roman educated class, and ensuring its survival in a form that would outlast the eventual decline of Greek as a widely known language in the western parts of the empire. Greek art was collected, admired, copied. The copies that fill the world's museums today, those marble versions of classical and Hellenistic bronze originals, are largely the product of Roman workshops working for Roman patrons who wanted the beauty of Greek art in their homes and gardens and public spaces. Athens itself, through all the political changes of these centuries, maintained a special status as the city of philosophy, the home of the great schools that continued to attract students from across the Roman world. The academy that Plato had founded, the Lyceum of Aristotle, the Garden of Epicurus, the Stoa where the Stoics had taught, these institutions, or their successors, continued to operate in Athens for centuries under Roman rule, drawing to the city the philosophically inclined young men of a vast empire. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, who ruled in the 2nd century CE and who was deeply enamored of Greek culture, undertook significant building projects in Athens, adding to the city an arch, a library, and a completed temple of Olympian Zeus, a temple begun in the Archaic period, left unfinished for centuries, and finally completed by Hadrian's patronage, its enormous columns still standing in the modern city, their honey-colored marble warm in the afternoon light. Their scale speaking quietly of the ambitions of the long-ago morning, when the first stones were laid. The landscape of Greece during these long centuries of Roman rule was still the same landscape. The mountains and the sea and the thin soil and the olive trees and the quality of the light in the early morning and the late afternoon. The ruins of older temples were already old, already being visited by travelers who came to see what earlier centuries had built. The Parthenon still stood on its rock, still intact, still housing its great statue of Athena. The sanctuary at Olympia still received its visitors every 4 years for the games. The oracle at Delphi, on the steep slopes of Mount Parnassus where the sacred spring ran cold and clear from the rock, still answered the questions of those who came to ask them, still spoke in the ambiguous, carefully considered language of prophecy that left room for the future to be whatever it turned out to be. The traveler and geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, traveled through Greece and recorded what he saw with the patient attention of a man who understood that he was documenting a world already ancient, already layered with the accumulated significance of centuries. His description of Greece is one of the most valuable documents of ancient scholarship, a slow, unhurried movement through the sanctuaries and cities and countryside of the Greek world, noting the statues and the temples and the local traditions and the myths attached to particular places, preserving information that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Reading Pausanias is like walking slowly through an old landscape with a very knowledgeable and somewhat melancholy companion, someone who sees not only what is there, but what is no longer there, who hears in the present silence the echo of all the voices that have spoken in a particular place. The slow fading of the ancient world, the long, gradual process by which the civilization of Greece and Rome was transformed into the medieval world of Christian Europe and Byzantine Christendom and Islamic civilization, was not the catastrophe that earlier historical narratives sometimes described it as. It was more complex than catastrophe, and in many ways more interesting. The ideas that the Greeks had developed, the philosophical frameworks, the mathematical and scientific methods, the literary forms, the aesthetic ideals, did not disappear. They were absorbed and transformed and transmitted, passing through different hands and different languages and different cultural contexts, changing as they traveled but never entirely losing the imprint of their origins. The Neoplatonist philosophers of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, carried the tradition of Greek philosophy forward in forms that blended Platonic metaphysics with religious mysticism, producing a synthesis of considerable intellectual power that influenced both the developing Christian theology of the period and the Islamic philosophy of the medieval centuries. The great Byzantine civilization that succeeded the Eastern Roman Empire preserved the Greek literary and philosophical heritage in the Greek language, maintaining a continuous thread of Greek scholarship through the long medieval centuries, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE brought Greek scholars and Greek manuscripts westward into the Italian Renaissance, there to spark the renewed engagement with classical antiquity that would be one of the driving forces of the transformation of European culture in the 15th and 16th centuries. The olive trees in the thin soil of the Greek hillsides were very old by then. They are very old now. An olive tree can live for 1,000 years, for 2,000, perhaps longer. The oldest trees in Greece, their trunks twisted by centuries of growth into forms of great complexity, their roots reaching deep into the pale, stony earth, their leaves silver-green in the light breeze off the Aegean, may have been standing when Pericles walked the streets of Athens, may have been ancient when Alexander crossed the Hellespont. They bear their fruit with the same patient regularity they have always borne it. In the autumn when the light softens and the air cools and the harvest begins, as it has always begun, with careful hands and the sound of the fruit falling into cloth spread on the earth beneath the branches. The stones of the temples are still there, worn by rain and wind and the long passage of time, inhabited by lizards and wild herbs. The Parthenon stands on its rock above the city, damaged and incomplete but still recognizable, still expressing something of what it was built to express: the aspiration toward beauty and proportion, and the right relationship between human beings and the powers that surround them. The sea is still the same sea, still the same uncertain color between blue and silver, still the same smell of salt on the warm air, still moving against the white and gray stones of the shore, with the same unhurried sound it has always made. Greece settled, very gradually, into the long afternoon of memory, into the condition of being not a living civilization conducting its own affairs on its own terms, but a touchstone, a reference point, a source to which other civilizations returned again and again to find something they needed. The ideas it had produced went on working in the minds of people who had never seen the Aegean, who spoke languages that Greek would not have recognized, who lived in climates and landscapes utterly unlike the dry mountains and bright sea of the Greek homeland. The conversations that Socrates had in the Agora of Athens, the theorems that Euclid demonstrated in the quiet rooms of the Alexandrian Mausoleum, the plays that Sophocles staged in the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Athenian Acropolis. These things went on mattering, went on reverberating, went on asking their questions, and offering their insights to minds that encountered them across the enormous distance of time. The stars came out, as they always do, above the old landscape, the same stars that the Neolithic farmers of Thessaly had watched from their mud-brick houses, the same stars that the sailors of the Mycenaean trading ships had navigated by, the same stars that Thales had looked at when he proposed his questions about the nature of things, that Aristotle had studied with a patience and a thoroughness that would not be matched for centuries, that Alexander had watched from his campaign tent in the far reaches of the Persian Empire, thinking of home. The stars moved in their slow, ancient courses above the mountains and the sea, above the ruins of the temples and the still-living olive trees, above the long quietness of the Greek night. And somewhere in that quietness, in the soft darkness between the mountains and the sea, the whole long story of ancient Greece lay gathered, all its centuries and its cities, its philosophers and its generals, its poets and its sculptors, its democrats and its tyrants, its moments of extraordinary achievement and its long passages of ordinary life, lay gathered and still, like a landscape in the hour before dawn, full of everything it contained, waiting with great patience for the light to come again and make it visible,